Thanks, thanks, Alex, for the introduction. Yeah, I've known Alex now for 20 years. What he did not mention was he was my undergraduate professor at the University of Tulsa. And so he was one of my first professors when I came there as a student athlete, ran track and field there. I can honestly say he saw me from like the horrible undergrad, didn't go to class, didn't really care about anything except sports. So now, like, here I am as a professor, which is totally weird, like how this all has come full circle, and I consider him a mentor and a professional colleague. So thank you for that. It's an honor to be giving the talk at the university you're at now, and good to see some other people I know, Dr. Valle and some other folks. So I'm just really honored to be with you all. I purposely only chose the University of Texas background. I have the shirt representing the organization which I talked about today, so you will hear no UT jokes or anything like that, even though you all have the better basketball team than we do. Anyways, moving on. So the talk today is called From the Field in the Classroom to the Lead, Coaches as Education Policy Change Agents in Texas. And what really got me interested in this work is my love for athletics. Athletics and sports is a centerpiece to what I do. I play them, I watch them all the time. Our family's really involved in it. And really what was like this kind of side interest, or I guess you could say main interest, kind of morphed into some of my work now. I'm going to talk about straight into that here today, but also exploring some of those works and some of those other intersections, looking at how coaches I have a paper right now, soon to be published, that's talking about how coaches play a role in getting students to attend school regularly and to address chronic absenteeism. And also have a paper that's soon to come out that's talking about coaches as computer science teachers. So all of my work intersects, as a good professor should. And anyways, just really excited to talk about this work today. I got to give a few acknowledgments. The work this was funded through the UT Austin College of Education, so I'm grateful for that. Some of this work was also done in conjunction with when I had Rachel Boggs as my GRA, and so thankful for her. I'm thankful for the Texas High School Coaches Association and their staff, which I'll talk about later, but that's Joe Martin, Glenn West, Becky Adams, Molly Fly, Libby Pacheco, and Brian Polk, who have just been great partners in this work. Also have to thank Texas A&M Coaching Academy, so hitting all the big publics here in the university, here in Texas, right? And they are great partners with the program that I'll talk about here in just a bit. John Thornton, Mike Thornton, and Rashad Thurston. And then also to thanks all the coaches in the state, all the athletic directors that I've been able to engage with over the years, and then the folks over at UIL, Dr. Susan Elza and her athletic staff, who have just been tremendous thought partners and answering questions of mine, and just being able to get an understanding of the landscape of athletics and coaches here in the state of Texas. So when we talk about coaches, or when people think about coaches, usually what comes to mind are these scenes of these inspiring coaches that change the way in which athletes or student athletes or grown adults are playing and engaging in the game. You think of famous ones like Coach Carter, or you think of Whoopi Goldberg, who was avid sports fan of the New York Knicks, who ended up being the coach of the Knicks. Everyone's favorite these days, Ted Lasso, right? The American football coach who goes overseas to go and coach in the Premier League. Mighty Ducks, right? Can't forget Happy Gilmore and the sage advice of his caddy / coach, right? And these images of coaches and inspiring, helping to shape the lives of these folks is really when we talk about coaching, this is what comes to mind, right? And then there's also this image, right, of coaches back in the day, right, on the football field wearing short shorts, tight shirts, right? This idea of like the coach with a whistle, who was run the show, run the program, right? But all of these images, whether it's this one or this one, I deal this coach as this authority figure, and this person who has a lot of knowledge and leadership to change or to shape the lives of people, usually typically younger than them, or even sometimes their peers as well, right? And in Texas, coaching is really important. And in Texas, as you all know, or many of you know, we take our athletics and our high school athletics seriously. And I found that out back in 2020 when I wrote an op-ed about the need for high school athletics during the pandemic, if we can do it safely, if folks will follow the rules. And my inbox was literally 50% of people saying, this is great, I'm glad you wrote this, we need this, and 50% of people thinking, I want to like injure and hurt or kill people. So like athletics is serious, as many as you know, guys, here in the state of Texas. And with that, how does, or a question that's always been on my mind is, how in a state like Texas, where athletics is so important and drives a lot of the agenda, especially around education, some of the stuff that happens in the ledge, how should we think of those who are running programs or in shaping the lives of student athletes, particularly at the high school level, when it comes to coaches? And so that's something of which I'm going to talk about and frame throughout my talk this week, today, which is about the coaches, and particularly young coaches, which I'll get to here in a second. But let me set a little bit of the stage real quick to talk about coaching here in the state. As many of you all know, we have over 1,200 public school districts that serve close to a little bit over 5 million students in Texas. And now over 50%, according to the Texas Education Agency, are of Hispanic descent, right? So we have a lot of students in a lot of school districts in a lot of schools. And in Texas, when you count middle and high school, we have over 36,000 coaches, those who receive a stipend or a check to coach in the state of Texas. And I lost my point. There we go. And in Texas, when you coach or when you compete in athletics, you are doing so under the organizational umbrella of the University Interscholastic League, otherwise known as UIL. And that's not just for athletics, that's any type of high school or middle school competitions. That includes academics, and that includes music as well. It sits underneath the university or under the auspices of University of Texas at Austin. It started in 1913 from a merger, of the Debating League of Texas High Schools and the Interscholastic Athletic Association. It's actually the largest interschool organization in the world. So a lot of states, and actually several countries, follow and model or try to do what UIL does when it comes to these different types of competitions that they host. As I said, there's academic, athletic, and music competitions. And in athletics, there's actually 14 athletic competitions, with a 15 being added this year in water polo for school year 2022-2023. And I'd be remiss in talking about the University Interscholastic League with also not talking about the history of the Prairie View Interscholastic League, which was from around 1920 to about 1970. And this was the governing body for Black high schools in Texas that at its peak had 500 member schools with all Black enrollment. So during the era of segregation, there was its own independent league for the Black schools. And then eventually it became merged into the UIL, or what is today known as the University Interscholastic League. There's a great book called Thursday Night Lights by Michael Hurd that gives you some context about the history of the PVIL and how it eventually began to be integrated into the UIL beginning in the 70s and into the 80s. And so when we think about coaching and coaching as a profession, there's a few things to keep in mind, right? Coaching is both an individual and social process. So coaches then themselves are seen as leaders, right? But they go through the socialization process with others to become better in their profession or become more experienced or advanced, which I'll talk about here in just a bit. It's complex and multifaceted, especially in a state like Texas, which I'll get to here in just a second as well. Their coaches are seen as influential partners in the athlete's sport experience. Very rarely can you think of a sport that doesn't involve a coach, someone that's helping the athlete to become better, to become more knowledgeable, to have more experience or expertise in their sports. Coaching experience and learning is often guided by seeing other coaches and learning from other coaches, and that helps to drive their knowledge. So in other words, you go from this apprenticeship model. You got to be an assistant coach, or you got to be water boy or towel boy, or whatever you want to call it, right? And you work your way up and you learn from those who are above you in order to get and achieve the position that you want to get into, like a head coach or running your own program or an athletic director. So there's this very traditional, old school, I'm not saying right, wrong, or different on that, but old school model of this apprenticeship where you work your way up to then become whatever type of coach you're wanting to become. And in the state of Texas, right, thinking about if you're in a rural or 1A school, which is our smaller schools here in the state, to how you eventually get to our 6A, our larger schools, our more urban school district, or some of the larger suburban districts. And the key also aspect of the coaching profession is around mentoring. Mentoring is seen, especially in the athletics world, as effective in athletic settings, right? Mentoring is a key part. Oftentimes you'll hear players or coaches talk about and give reference to those who helped shape their career trajectories or their athletic accomplishments, often in terms of a mentoring or mentoring relationship. Mentoring can be both one-on-one, a one-to-one model, but also a community practice-based model, which I'll talk about here in a second as well. So mentoring isn't just something like I have one mentor who has shown me the way, but like there's a collection of folks that can be involved in the mentoring process. Over the years, especially in the athletic research, and also in the practice world, there's been a shift around mentoring and learning from classroom and kind of sit and get instruction to more practical environment. Like how do we engage in mentoring relationships with coaches out on the field or out where they're actually practicing or doing their career, right? And then mentoring is often seen as a key component of the coaching profession, both explicit and implicit, right? Which I'll talk to when we get through some of the findings of the way in which some of these coaches in this program talked about their mentoring relationship. But it can vary, just like in any types of other mentoring relationships we got, right? A lot of us are university either students or faculty members, right? And we know that like who you are mentored by or have a relationship with can vary based upon that person's time, where they are in their career, et cetera, right? The same is true also in the coaching profession. But in Texas, we do have a problem. And this is not unique just to Texas, but because Texas leads the way and has so many coaches, it is a more complex problem, I would make the argument. So in Texas, on average, we lose around 20% of coaches within their first 5 years. For those who are in the teacher education world, you might see some similarities to those that are in the teaching profession, right? Oh, by the way, coaches in Texas have to be full-time employees of the school district in which they work on. So right, then we'll get into that here in a second. What gets to my third point, right? Texas is one of the few states that requires coaches to be full-time employees within their school district. So in other states, where I could be a car salesman during the day and then go coach in the afternoon, that's not the case in Texas. And so oftentimes, due to certification requirement, just the overall job market, there are a lot of opportunities, coaches come in and recognize, you know what, I can do other things with my time or with my experiences than coach, and also more than likely teach or do something else within a district. And so there's this unique intersection of teaching and coaching that I, hopefully by the end of this talk, will have convinced you all that we all as researchers and as practice folks and as policymakers haven't actually engaged in enough. That, right, that's not coaches separate and teachers separate, that like coaches are teachers, coaches are educators, and how we think about coaches and coaching should be in the same way in which we think about teachers or educators. And how does that impact the work that we do in the ed policy and ed practice spaces? The career trajectory can be difficult, particularly in certain sports, right? So like I talked about moving up from rank to rank, from assistant coaches to head coaches, but also thinking about from like middle school to high school coaches, right? So a lot of our first year, our early career coaches start off on middle school or start off as the freshman coach, right? And if you're the freshman coach, Let's talk about like football, for example. You coach the freshman team on Thursdays, you're capturing film and doing laundry on Fridays, you're going to all the varsity meetings on the weekend, and then the grind continues on during that season. And oh, by the way, you go from season to season, right? So, like coaching football, then you're doing basketball, then you're doing wrestling, and you might do track, and you might do baseball, depending on your school size, right? So it's a grind, and it can be a grind, especially for some of those young and early career coaches. And then similarly to teaching, there can be leadership issues. Leadership issues at the athletic director position, leadership issues are at the school level in terms of principal leadership that can affect whether coaches stay in the profession or not. And so these are some of the reasons why coaches might leave or might not stay in the profession. And so with that, and recognizing the problem, let's go to the next slide. It's coming. There we go. The Texas High School Coaches Association actually decided, hey, we need to get involved in this. We need to try to figure out if we're going to be representative of coaches throughout the state. We need to be involved in trying to figure out how to address this attrition problem, coaches leaving the profession. So let me get a little bit about the Texas High School Coaches Association real quick. Like the UIL, I guess everything in Texas we like to do bigger and better. It's the largest association of its kind with over 24,000 members, located in San Marcos, Texas, and organized around 8 regions. It focuses on improving the coaching profession in Texas, helping to provide training and opportunities for coaches to advance in their career, and a strong advocate for athletics in the state, for providing opportunities for students and providing opportunities for adults to coach within the state. So it's a very a large organization with coaches that represent all of the UIL sports. And also of particular note, it advocates for public education. So it's a big public school advocate. A lot of times people, when they think about or have heard about THSCA, they think of their work, it's either Wear Purple or Purple Days that they do around advocating for public education. I'll talk about at the end when I talk about some of the implications. They were very big on the homeschool bill that passed in the Texas legislature last year and trying to advocate against that because they felt it was an attack on public ed. So a very influential organization. And they created a program that they called the Rock Coaches Mentoring Program. So their way in which to try to address this attrition problem was the creation of a program that focused on pairing or matching rare, outstanding, compelled, knowledgeable young coaches with veteran coaches that have been in the field for 10 plus years. And these could be coaches that are still coaching right now, that could be now have moved into assistant or assistant athletic director or athletic director positions at the high school level, or it could be retired coaches. But focused on, hey, we recognize that we're losing our young coaches. And by young, I'm not necessarily talking about age. I'm talking about in their early years of their career. And how do we, and thinking about if we pair, young coaches with mentors, provide them a curriculum that's created and delivered by the Texas A&M Coaching Academy, what does it mean then, or what can that do to try to address some of the issues that we're seeing in the coaching profession in Texas? And so my talk today is going to be, or what I'm going to go through here, is some of the findings related to the first year of this program. So from 2021 all the way up until now, and what the Rocks, and the Rocks are the young coaches. So when you hear me talk about Rocks, those are the young coaches, and you hear me talk about mentors, those are the veteran coaches. And what have they learned from the program, and how has that impacted and shaped their career trajectories and what they want to do as young coaches in the field? And are they likely to stay? Which I think that question is still remains to be answered. And so this picture captures last year's intake meeting of those Rocks at Cowboy Stadium, who's a partner, or with the Cowboys, who's a partner in this work. And it highlights the fact that a diverse group of coaches, which I'll get to here in a second, both on race, age, gender, but also in terms of sport. And so for us at the University of Texas, there were three important research questions that we wanted to, have answered as it relates to the ROC program. First, to what extent does the mentoring program, the ROC, facilitate opportunities for coaches within the profession? So in other words, does the mentoring program help to generate opportunities for coaches who are looking to move up or looking to maybe possibly change their UIL division or classification, or move from the type of school in which they work at, middle school to high school, for example, or maybe going from somewhere more rural to something urban? In what ways are young coaches connecting with mentor coaches? And what about and what around and what are their conversations like? What are they talking about? And then finally, how do coaches describe their career trajectories and the influence of the ROC program on those trajectories? Remember, we're losing around 20% of coaches within their first 5 years. And the goal of this program is to hopefully, bring that number down. And so from this program, trying to understand how coaches are now talking about their career trajectories, trying to understand, like, now that I'm with someone or I'm paired with someone or part of this program, how do I see my career going and moving forward? So there's 19 ROCs, or those who are part of the program, 14 men and 5 women. I'll talk a little bit at the end about this next class, which is the next class of ROCs, which is actually around 60, and it's a little bit more, a little bit more parity in terms of gender, a range of ethnicities and diversities when it comes to the makeup of these participants. 9 UIL sports represented, and I think, in fact, next year's class has all of them represented. And then also an interesting part within this, and not anything that was part of the application process or anything, 11 of the 19 actually played intercollegiate athletics. So there's a lot of talk in the research and a lot of talk when it comes to trying to get coaches, is the fact that we want to pool coaches who have also played either at the college or professional level or done some type of play. And so the fact that we had here in this initial sample, 11 that played intercollegiate athletics was interesting. I'm happy to answer some questions about that as well. So we interviewed the ROCs. We've done initial intake interviews when they first joined the program, and we've done follow-up interviews with them, and we plan to do another round of interviews with them. We've observed them in many, many different settings. Again, that initial meeting that you saw that picture from, the Texas High School Coaches Association hosts a big coaching school. So we followed them around during their 3 days at the coaching school, and been interacting with them at various athletic competitions throughout the state, and taking some observational field notes and learning from them. And then some surveys as well that have been done about the ROCs and their experience in the program. And we coded data to understand coaches' sense making and views on mentoring and how they describe leadership and career trajectories. Had multiple rounds of coding between myself and our research team. And we tried to pull emergent themes from the data, and as best we could, triangulate that data with what we observed and the survey responses. And so with that, let me get into and talk through some of those findings that we had from our interviews and our data. So one of our findings was the sense of belonging. For many of our ROCs, it was a chance to connect with other coaches across grade levels, districts, and sports, being part of the program. And this was important for a couple of reasons. One, oftentimes, and you think about our own work, right? Oftentimes, as much as we want to talk about being collaborative or working in partnership or connecting, a lot of times for a lot of our work, it's isolating or it's siloed. You're doing that one thing that only you can do or believe only you can do. And oftentimes it's not in partnership with others, or can just in itself feel isolating, right? But this in the ROC program gave coaches a sense of belonging, that, hey, there are other coaches who are also in their first couple of years, who are in similar situations like I am. So for example, Catherine, who's a softball coach, talked about learning from other coaches who are dealing with similar issues, athletes and coworkers, has provided me opportunities to understand how to navigate our profession. Catherine is interesting because the district that in which she is a part of, she was one of the only first year coaches. So within their first 5 years at that district. So there's that isolation in terms of talk, like who else is here and who else is in the same boat with me. But here I am part of this program now, and there's others like me. And there's others like me, not only in terms of the number of years experience, but also in terms of in similar district sizes or coaching the similar type of sports, right? And I'm learning from them how to navigate some of these issues that I've seen as a young coach in this profession. Johnny, who coaches football, talked about just being able to engage with other coaches who have the same number of years coaching as I do is a blessing. We're having to deal with the same situations, doubts, successes, and failures. And so I get a chance to connect with them about these things. This is interesting because Johnny, and maybe we can get in a conversation about this later, right? And maybe so it's tied to the sport of football. Also talked about like the ways in which, or ways he can't talk about successes or failures or doubts, because as this up and coming assistant coach, it seemed like he had to have it all together. But he talked about that through this program and being part of this program, allow them to share some of those experiences, some of those doubts, some of those successes with others who were like him to figure out, well, how do I navigate this? Or how do I navigate working with a difficult coach? Or, you know what, we aren't winning. Like, what does that mean for me in my career, right? So the sense of belonging was just ever present throughout our data. The next one was connecting coaching to teaching. This is not a question actually that we actually explicitly asked of our coaches within our interview protocol or surveys or anything we were trying to necessarily observe, but it kept showing up over and over again, which goes against this narrative that coaches are always or just only thinking about their sport, right? And even goes against that typical traditional narrative of all these coaches should remind me of my high school social studies teachers, right? And that has its own kind of connotation, right? When you think of a high school coach, social studies, right? I'll leave that there for maybe a little longer conversation later, but right. But understanding that their coaching was connected to their teaching and vice versa. So Michael talked about, as a young coach, I'm learning quickly that I have to be good at both teaching and coaching. So I'm constantly asking myself, how does my coaching, my teaching benefit the other? Where can I make improvements and what opportunities exist to become better? What was also really fascinating in our interviews with these people when it came to talking about teaching and coaching was they saw their success or their ability to move up in the ranks, or however you want to put it, tied directly with their teaching. Now, I don't know if this is a young coach thing, something that we need to go and ask is like, how do you all who've been in the profession for a while see your teaching, your coaching intersection? But like the fact of like how well I do or how I'm able to move up is tied directly to not only what I'm able to do on the field, but also what I do in the classroom. In other words, folks, district schools won't hire me if I'm not a good teacher or a good educator. And that was really fascinating. Christina talked about, I want to excel in both the classroom and on the athletic field. And I can learn from others in the program about how to balance being a great teacher and a winning coach. So again, I think for us as researchers, what does it mean to be a coach and teacher? Or just a coach that is a teacher, right? And how do we move away, especially for those of us that are in Texas, from this separation that we oftentimes talk about with coaching and teaching, or coaching or teaching, right? That like our coaches, especially in the state, are educators, and that they also are interacting with our students and student athletes on a daily basis, oftentimes more so than just a traditional teacher. Charlotte was interesting too. So I did not consider coaching until later in my college career. I knew I wanted to be a teacher, and it seemed that coaching could help me land a teaching gig. Now, after a few years of teaching and coaching, I'm beginning to see how I teach in the classroom is similar to how I coach on the court. So for those of us that are interested in teacher professional development or teacher best practices, how do we then think about delivering PD for teachers that are coaches or coaches that are teachers that can train in the classroom, but also on the field? And what does that look like and what benefit for students who are interacting with that coach, both inside the school, but also out on the practice field? Mentorship, obviously, in the mentoring program was a reoccurring theme. So being mentored by experienced coaches who have done what they aspire to do, achieved success, and could offer them advice, right? So Clay, I remember when I was first paired with my mentor, I was in La La World. This was someone who I had followed on Twitter, knew about their success, and had hoped to meet one day. The fact that I can get knowledge and build my career on what he has to offer me is huge. So Clay was a coach in a small district, and got paired with someone who it was. I make the argument was quite famous or is quite famous in the Texas high school football world. So the fact that Clay could be paired with someone who is a who's who was eye-opening to me. And also, too, a little bit about Clay was Clay actually before the program was actually thinking about leaving, the coaching profession due to some of the experiences that Clay was having at their school within their district. And so what we're really fascinated to talk with Clay now here in a few weeks, because what changed, right? What has made you stay? And actually, Clay has left that district and has moved up. But like, how much was this mentoring relationship helpful in terms of where you've now gone and how you see your career? Alexander talked about, I'm not sure of how to navigate the coaching field in Texas. So Alexander is one of those folks who moved to Texas, wasn't from the state, and was learning about the fact that, oh wait, I can't go and do this and coach. I gotta be an employee in the district, so I gotta teach and be a coach. So how do I go to another school district, or how do I get to somewhere bigger? My mentor and I have talked about some of these possibilities and what it could look like for my career. So being paired with someone who could tell them and show them the ins and outs of Texas athletics and high school athletics within the state. And I'm glad you're recording, because you will have my spelling mistake on the recording. That's great. Opportunities, right? Obvious, right? Networking, applying for jobs, access to experience, right? These opportunities that were provided within this ROC program was beneficial. So I thought I was going to be having a career in this one part of Texas, West Texas. However, ROC has provided opportunities to seek and get other jobs that allow me to experience things like a state championship as a coach. Chris's story is quite interesting, and that actually will be coming out in the paper here in a few weeks, actually, hopefully in a few weeks, where we talked about how the mentoring relationship that the mentoring relationship and the opportunities that were provided through the ROC Fellowship allow them to have this jump from this part of the state that he wasn't really, I wouldn't say really keen on, but a chance to move up and experiencing a big time football program, athletic program that provided way more opportunities than what he was getting beforehand. And a lot of that was he had talked about to the mentoring program and his mentoring relationship that he was able to foster. Leadership aspirations. So discussing and planning for what they will do next and how that looks like from a leadership perspective or position. This is interesting too, because I know like back in the 90s and the 80s and so forth, there was, and some of you older folks might know this better than I do, but there was research being done around like who gets to be or who becomes school leaders and district leaders, right? Often pull from the athletic fields and coaching ranks, and those who are, the belief was they were able to coach or be able to win or seem to be successful. They could be good school leaders or district leaders, associate soups, district liaisons, et cetera, right? And in recent years, that's kind of, you don't see as much research or literature around that. And so, but from this, we were finding that folks were often talking about their leadership aspirations, right? So not just within athletics, but also outside athletics. So for example, Tina talked about how she had told her mentor that she aspired to be an athletic director, but wasn't quite sure what it looked like. Like, how do I get there? What does that pathway look like? And so being able to talk about and discuss the possibilities, and even people who are leading major programs across the country, across the state, was huge. And even leading all of Texas. I purposefully, I spelled basketball wrong too. This is wow. Sorry, Alex, I am embarrassing you in our 20 years of knowing each other. I purposely select this picture. The woman on the right in the red is the athletic director for UIL, so oversees all of the high school athletic competitions in the state. And what was fascinating, across all 19 interviews, and in many of our conversations and observation throughout the past year, folks talked about wanting to be her or wanting to aspire to have that position, both men and women, across all types of sports, right? So the fact that, and she has a very fascinating story, an amazing leader, but talked about the fact that they wanted to embody and learn those leadership qualifications and characteristics so that they too could hopefully run athletic department, or even lead the whole entire state when it comes to high school athletic competitions. And then Daniel talked about seeing himself as a head coach and trying to learn from his mentor the different ways and aspects of which how you get to achieve that position. I should have said, I'm sorry I didn't say that back when I was talking about the participants, the majority of the ROCs or the mentees are at the assistant coach level. There were a few, I can't remember how many, I think it's about maybe two or three who are head coaches of some type. And let me also be clear too, at the high school level, some coach middle school and some were head coaches at middle school. But when folks talked about being a head coach, they were talking about being that varsity head coach, right? The head football coach, head softball coach at the varsity level. And so what does that, so with Daniel's situation here was talking about how does the mentor in that relationship help to lead to their future leadership aspirations and becoming a leader, or a head coach in this case. So some takeaways from this study, some takeaways from this work that we've been doing and still engaged in doing. What does it mean for mentoring models and designing them and implementing in the coaching profession, and also too, we can say the educator profession, right? What does mentoring mean for shaping the trajectories and career trajectories for coaches, especially those who want to advance in their career? And by advance, I don't want to make it sound like they're all chasing to be head coaches, but advancing in terms of possibly running a school, possibly being in district leadership, possibly just becoming better coaches, right? We know teachers, and we know from the research that there's teachers who just want to become better teachers. So what does it mean when they're involved in a mentoring program or a mentoring model to become better coaches and become better advocates for student athletes? And so how do we think about professional development at the intersection of both coaching and teaching, especially in a state like Texas, where our coaches are more than likely teachers or educators working within that district? What are the leadership opportunities that exist? And how do we help our younger coaches, those who are in the years 1 through 5, to obtain leadership opportunities or experiences to then hopefully one day lead our districts and our schools? And we have to think about this turnover problem in coaching, right? Because the turnover problem in coaching impacts teaching in this state. Because if our coaches don't want to stay, then those are teachers that we're also losing. And those could be very effective teachers, right? And what does that mean? And right, and for our student athletes, for our schools, and how do we address that? And then from the association standpoint, or organizational standpoint, what does it mean for coaches who are involved in these type of programs and are tied with associations for being advocates for things like public schooling in Texas and for policy changes related to the profession. How can we, or not, I should say how can we, I'm not advocating something here, but how can coaches become and more involved in our policymaking effort? And we think about the coaches and coaching profession and those associations that are involved in shaping public education here in the state. So some implications for future research, policy, and practice, and then I look forward to your questions. One, coaches as educators in their roles in shaping school district policy, right? And state policy. What does that look like? And what's their role within that? And how do we think of coaches as policy agents? Efficacy of mentorship and professional development models. I talked a lot about the intersection between teaching and coaching professional development. How do we think about mentoring relationships and how that impacts career trajectories? What are the resources and tools to support young coaches in their first few years of profession, both as a coach, but also as a teacher? This is just a hunch, and hopefully something we'll be able to ask later on, is if a coach is struggling on the field, is there some type of connection to how they are doing in their classroom? Or if a coach is achieving success in the classroom, how does that translate to their success on the field? That's an interesting question that hopefully someone or me will be able to go and answer and find out, right? Coaches need opportunities to develop teaching and coaching schools. So how do we provide ways and space to do so? Again, thinking about our coaches as educators and teachers. What are case studies and scenarios that can be put in front of them that they can engage in this work and understanding their role as educators? And then what does this mean for the future of coaching leadership academies and programs? Are there opportunities here in the state of Texas or elsewhere that we can get similar to what the Texas A&M Coaching Academy does, which does a fantastic job, that tries to get coaches, give them the skills, gets them a degree or certificate of some type, and then that enables them, equips them to be able to go out in our schools and districts and become leaders and coaches for our students, student athletes in their community. And with that, I thank you so much for the opportunity. Thank you for listening through that. Looking forward to the question Q&A. Thank you, Alex, again for the introduction. And yeah, thank you all at Texas Tech.
Josh, thank you so much, or Dr. Childs, thank you so much for the talk. And if we were in person, this is why I mean, virtual is great because we can be anywhere and do this, but if we were in a room, there would be 30 people clapping right now. So I want you to feel that energy. That was a really, really interesting overview of not only the issue, but your research on it. And I think if you probably didn't have a chance while you were talking, but if you look in the chat, there are a lot of folks who are sort of identifying with the kinds of experiences that you're talking about. Actually, I myself, as a former high school basketball coach, can see a lot of need there. But now's our time for question and answer. And I mean, I always have questions. So Josh, you're stuck with a question from me, probably, if no one speaks up right off the bat, because I'm terrible at wait time. But let me give it a shot. Anybody want to start us off with a question for Dr. Childs? You can type it into the chat, or you can unmute and ask. So there is a new question in the chat. Dr. Childs, do you have any thoughts on coaches as policy actors, specifically in the school finance space, from Levi?
Yeah, yeah, great question. Yeah, so I think, I think I'm thinking back to last session here in Texas, when the homeschool bill was being making its way through the state ledge and eventually became law. It was really fascinating to see the ways in which, led by the High School Coaches Association, the ways in which coaches were engaging in an important to them and would impact them in their their profession, the ways in which they're engaging policy through social media, through the testifying in front of the ledge, from reaching out to their representatives and the legislators, to engage in the community. It was really fascinating because, I will have to admit, one of my deficit kind of framing or lens around coaches is I think a lot of people think this way, is that coaches are about this thing that's in front of them. It's the next goal, it's the next game, it's the next practice. And you get through that and you do teaching, you go home because they already have enough on their plate, right? And so to see the fact of the way in which they're engaging in policy made me think two things over the past year. One, we haven't really, again, made the connection between coaches as teachers or coaches as educators. I should stop saying teachers, coaches as educators, and that they are also on the front line in shaping what happens from a policy perspective. Now, they didn't get their way with the homeschool bill, or the association's overall standpoint didn't get what they intended to. But the way in which they are engaging was really fascinating. I think there's something to be said there. And two, what does it mean then for coaches to become bigger advocates within the state when it comes to issues like what Levi asked about school finance and the funding of schools, and the pushing for the possibility and potential of stuff like public education or just more education funding in general. And so I think there's a lot of potential there. I know there's some not trepidation, some legality in terms of what you can go and advocate or go and be a policy actor for and so forth. But I think there are some influential ways in which coaches can help shape the narrative and help move communities to become more involved in school finance and become more involved in what happens in terms of what gets funded and what doesn't get funded in the state. And I think the next year will, with what is being rumored will we come on the board with within the state legislature, could be another opportunity for coaches in the state to become involved in shaping policy and shaping what happens and what happens to them, right? So hopefully that helps answer your questions. That's how I see it. And I think there's lots of untapped potential or thinking about that there when it comes to coaches.
Yeah, really interesting. There's another question in the chat, but as we move to that, I think your point about coaches being able to shape the narrative is a really important one, because they have a voice not only within the school as an organization, but also with the public. I mean, in my experience as a coach and then working in the field of education, coaches have more interaction with the community than your typical teacher. And their ability to be involved like that, I think, would be really, really important. Daniel Foreman has, I think I've got your name right, Daniel. It's Daniel. Has asked a question. Are there certain sports in your research that you might make an argument for the coaches being less supported in comparison with other sports?
I mean, yeah, we're in Texas, or I'm in Texas. I don't know where everyone else is at. So we know that, for example, football is king, queen, it's everything here in the state. I think one thing that what we do well in the state, though, and I remember being interviewed about this when I was on this like kind of back and forth. They were trying to set up as this debate thing, and for should we get rid of high school athletics and focus more so on academics? And I was obviously arguing for the need for high school athletics. I think one thing we do well in the state is whether you're competing in academics, whether you're competing in athletics, whether you're competing in music, you all win if you win a state championship or you win a UIL competition, you receive the same thing. You receive the same state championship. So if you win in one act play UIL competition, you receive the same medal and the same state championship trophy as those who won at AT&T Stadium, the 6A football state championship. It's the same thing. And I think that's important. I think it's important for folks because to recognize that what we do well in the state is recognize all of the abilities, all of the competitions, all of the state, all of the sports within our state. But there are genuine differences, right? Football coaches tend to make more in the state. Football tends to be the main driver of the news cycles and what happens, hiring and firing, and who becomes ADs is usually shaped by football or is influenced by football. And so I think there is something to be said about what the support in our investment in other sports look like. I can talk about basketball, for example. If you talk to people who've been in the state for a long time, they'll tell you 30, 40 years ago, basketball in the state of Texas was, I mean, we played basketball. We had basketball players like Shaquille O'Neal back in the 90s, late 80s, right? But now, if you've looked over the last 20 or so years of basketball in the state, Texas is now a basketball powerhouse that can compete. And when I say can't compete, I'm talking about this, its coaching level, its coaching reputation, the type of student athletes that are coming out of state, but those that are traditionally found on the East Coast or the Midwest. So you're seeing that in basketball, you're seeing stuff like swimming and diving, and you're also seeing that in sports like track and field. So I think there is need for some more investment and some more intentionality around the other sports. The associations like the Texas High School Coach Association have made it a mission for the past several years to be able to invest in some of these other sports besides just football, and to really highlight what's happening and to make improvements and see improvements in that. But I think you're right, Daniel. I think there needs to be some more support around some of these other sports, and also to the impact that those coaches have on students and student athletes, right? Because and particularly for those other sports or those assistant coaches that are part of those other sports, they're coaching more than just that sport. They're doing other sports, spring, winter, and fall, across all of the seasons. And so for a lot of coaches, they're not just the football coach. The head coach usually is, right? Especially as you get to the bigger divisions. But most of the time, they're also the football coach, and I coach basketball, and I coach, as I say, wrestling and baseball or so forth. So I think you're absolutely right in what you're talking about. I think you're starting to see movement in the state of Texas to support and invest in some of these other sports.
We still have time for.
I agree with that. Yeah, that's a really good point. And I don't know, to your point, Daniel, you're making, I'm not sure. I mean, I don't know how we move. You wonder how do we move beyond that symbiotic relationship, right? Or I'm sorry, how do we move from this lore of football in a state like Texas? Yeah, we all work at or are part of universities, or many of us, that football is the main the main key, right? Like if I tell people I work at the University of Texas, the next comment's gonna be something related to how horrible our football team is, right? Like, Texas Tech and you all's hire with your football coach was huge in the state because he was a former high school coach who coached just a decade ago and was winning state championships. So, I'm not sure how we move beyond it, but it's really fascinating.
Well, we still have time for one more question if anyone has one. You can unmute and just ask it, or you can type it in the chat. So I can't not ask a question, Josh. So to follow up on my comment earlier, I always find it interesting when we talk about coaching and teaching and sort of how they intersect. And I really do think that the intersection with the public is an important one. And I wonder, they say that teaching is one of the most publicly permeable professions, meaning that parents can come in and sort of, in some ways dictate what teachers do with their children based on, unique needs, etc. I never had as much interaction with parents as a teacher as I did when I was a coach. I mean, they're not just, suggesting things to do. They're in your face telling you what position their son's going to play, how many minutes he's going to play. It was intense. And I'm wondering if, as part of these mentoring programs, and also thinking about sort of the policy advocacy role, that the communication with stakeholders or the communication with parents and community, is that something that you found the ROC participants, having questions about, or is it just that's not an issue?
Really great question. It mixed. I think some of it was mixed because one of their role as assistant coaches. So, or they're the middle school coach who helps out with the high school coaches or the high school team on the weekends or on Fridays or whenever there's a game. So it was mixed because, a lot of them didn't really talk about it because, they're in some ways buffered because of their positionality or their role or where they work at currently. Some of them did and talk about it in terms of the playing time and how does my kid get better, or what are they doing wrong or whatever. What was interesting though is like, again, when I was talking about that connection between coaching and teaching, a lot of it was talked about, or some of it was talked about how their student or how their student athlete was doing in the classroom and what that meant for them performance wise, or their ability to be able to perform on the field, or if they're eligible or something like that. I think, in just anecdotal conversation, informational conversations I have with coaches throughout the state and athletic directors, you're right. And I would make the argument it's even more so probably even when you're coaching, that parents are having more of a say or more vocal about athletics. Students are having access to coaches at an earlier age, are doing competitive type of programs and leagues at a younger age, are able to have a say on what teams they go to and where they go and how they play. And for some, they talked about having a concern that what that would be if they were to be a head coach and how they would deal with it and how they navigate that. That's one thing for me, anecdotally, has been very interesting. And, doing my research, and I use Twitter. A lot of coaches, especially around the state, are very active on Twitter for a variety of reasons, for recruiting for their student athletes, to it's a way to network. You don't see many comment about parenting and the role of parents, and probably for the good reason, right? But it's fascinating. They'll comment about a whole bunch of stuff, but they don't really say much about parenting or parents. But I think, in private or just in regular conversation, there's a lot to be said about that. And so you asked a great question, Alex. I wonder over the next several years if we're going to see how the ways in which parents have been involved when it comes to school board and what it's taught in the classroom impacts coaching in terms of, more so in terms of not only who gets hired and fired, but what actually gets run. Plays getting drawn up, right? And that seems, for some folks, they might be rolling their eyes like, yeah, right, never happened. Well, yeah, right. Did you think that you'd see books being banned or conversations about X or Y happening in school districts? And yet here we are, right? Our son's been playing with this AAU coach since they were in 4th grade. They should be the next high school coach here. And the influence of parents to be able to shape what happens. So I think that's an interesting policy question that will need to be addressed. And I think it's coming faster than we want to believe or recognize.
Josh, I can't thank you enough. Thank you for that answer. Thank you for actually your attention to all of our questions. If you guys have further questions for Dr. Childs, his email is on the screen right now. Please feel free to reach out to him. And I'm not joking, follow him on Twitter. It's worth it. Josh, thank you so much. Dr. Childs, thank you so much. It's been wonderful having you here.
Thank you,
everybody. I'm going to end that. See you.